I'm very proud of our country. I think we are demonstrating to the world what it means to have good values, unlike our neighbors to the south.
In many Midwestern states, wheat is no longer being harvested. It's being burned right on the fields because no one is buying. Supermarket shelves or empty meat prices have surged by 50%. Consumers are confused. Towns that once thrived on agriculture have turned into ghost towns, all because an agricultural superpower is gradually losing its ability to feed itself, not due to natural disasters, but because it's being shut out of the game by its former allies. At the end of June, Canada signed the largest agricultural agreement in its history with the European Union, a deal worth tens of billions of dollars lasting through 2030. And while Trump was still grappling with a new tax order, the world's dinner table was no longer set for America. This is Trump's worst nightmare, and potentially the beginning of a looming hunger for Americans. You need to watch this video today before your last meal becomes a luxury commodity. A massive deal that every American farmer hoped to secure with Europe has now gone to the neighbor. On a morning in early July, shipping containers sit idle in front of a packing plant in Kansas. Everything is ready, but there are no more buyers. That order once sent to Germany every year was just canceled, because they found another partner, Canada. It may sound simple, but to farmers here it feels like losing an entire season, not due to drought, not due to pests, but because they were removed from the table. The new agreement between Canada and the European Union, signed in late June 2025, wasn't headline news in the US. It arrived quietly, no grand press conference, no fanfare. But its value is crystal clear, over 75 billion euros, stretching to 2030, focused on key agricultural products like wheat, soybeans, beef, dairy, and grains. In other words, everything America used to dominate. Under this deal, Canadian goods will receive full or substantial tariff exemptions. When entering the EU, some tariffs cut by as much as 70%. Their shipments are prioritized due to transparent supply chains, low carbon output, on-time delivery, and consistent policy. And what stings the most, the US has no seat at the table. All this unfolded just days after the US president left the G7 summit without securing any joint declaration. As he walked out of the meeting, the other leaders remained. And in a discreet corner, Canada walked in and signed the deal. They secured the most valuable thing, Europe's trust. Many Americans had hoped the G7 would be the stage for the US to regain its footing. After so much uncertainty, they looked for a strong message, a strategic handshake to expand export markets. They weren't asking for miracles, just for America to be welcomed and chosen. But what happened was the exact opposite. And what's even more bitter, while the administration squabbled with tech giants' mayors, and states the neighbor to the north quietly walked away with the market share that once belonged to the US. In the last 2 days of June, America was consumed by the political divorce between the White House and a major tech billionaire, once a key social media ally. Then came the tense standoff with the mayor of Los Angeles, home to millions of Americans. The whole government got caught up in internal chaos, and during that time, outside the world, had already chosen its business partner. If you've ever lived in the Midwest, you understand this best. People here don't demand greatness or grand victories. They just want crops to sell, factories to run, and grocery prices to stay stable. They don't need Washington to win everywhere just to show up sign deals and keep its word. If it had been the US signing that agreement, things would be different now. Millions of tons of agricultural goods wouldn't be sitting in storage. Trucks would be full cold storage, lit up banks ready to finance the next planting season. And consumers, you, me, and millions of families wouldn't be paying extra dollars for the most basic meals. But instead, Canada signed, and America was absent. In the first half of 2025, Canadian agricultural exports to the EU rose 37%. US orders fell over 60%. Some were returned for failing chemical residue standards. Others delayed due to sudden tariff changes. The rest, no one wants to take the risk anymore, simply because they no longer trust. One French importer put it bluntly, "I don't want to wake up every morning and check Twitter to see what today's tariff is." They don't need the cheapest produce. They need a supplier who delivers on time to standard, and that supplier is no longer the US. Consumers are now feeling the consequences. A Yale Budget Lab survey shows each American household is spending an extra $4,900 a year due to rising food prices. It all started with something that seemed distant, like a trade deal, but in the end it shows up in every grocery bill. And this isn't over, because the deal just signed is only the beginning. What comes next, lost contracts, shuttered factories, silent towns, is already taking shape. Those who once hoped to be saved are now trying to save themselves. And America, once the center of the agricultural world, now stands on the verge of becoming an outsider. But that's a story for the next chapter, when the ripple effects of this agreement reach every community, every field, and every dinner table in your own home. When a field loses its buyer, it's not just the farmer's story. It marks the beginning of a long silence, from the farm to the supermarket, from truck drivers to your own family. There were once harvest seasons full of promise. Farmers in the Midwest used to be certain that thousands of tons of soybeans, corn, or wheat would leave their farms, follow familiar routes, reach the ports, and be shipped to Europe. That market was once a reliable backbone, but this year no orders came. The fields are still golden, but the contracts have gone north, where Canada has just signed a preferential deal with the European Union, and so everything stops. When goods stop moving, it's not just farmers who are affected. The trucks once busy running between farms and cold storage now sit idle in parking lots. River routes once prioritized for agricultural transport now give way to cargo from elsewhere. Toll fees increase loading costs. Rise warehousing fees. Climb. A shipment that used to cost $2,000 now runs close to $2,500. That price doesn't disappear, it simply gets folded into the bill consumers pay every day. At the supermarket, you might not notice right away. A can of meat goes up by a few dozen cents. A carton of eggs rises slightly. The morning cup of coffee costs more without any clear explanation. But collectively, according to estimates from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, food prices for home consumption have risen over 2% this year, while dining out has gone up nearly 4%. It may not seem like much at first glance, but calculated monthly, a family of 4 could be spending an extra $150 to $200 simply due to what seems like distant changes in the global supply chain. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes of the retail system, businesses are scrambling to stay afloat. Large chains like Walmart and Target have no choice but to raise listed prices. Not just because food is more expensive, but because packaging, steel, aluminum, everything that makes up a simple product, is affected by unstable tax policies. Costs gradually rise, and the cycle loops endlessly between factories, stores, and your wallet. From supermarkets, we return to the towns, once the heart of agricultural communities. There used to be small stores selling farming supplies, busy bakeries each morning, gas stations where people filled up and chatted about the crops. But lately, many of those doors have closed. Local banks have begun calling in loans because farmers can no longer make payments on time. Schools have cut classes because student numbers are dwindling. Not because the population is aging, but because many families have moved seeking jobs, trying to hold on to their lives. The USDA warns that more than 30% of rural towns could lose over 10% of their population within the next year. This is not just a statistic. It means homes with no lights on farmers markets without attendees, dinner tables no longer filled with talk of harvests, but with questions of whether to stay or leave. Many city dwellers may still think the Canada-EU deal is a farmer's issue, but in reality, all roads lead back to your dinner table. When growers can't sell, shippers raise prices. When logistics costs rise, product prices change. When supermarkets have to import more expensive goods, they don't absorb the difference, they adjust the shelf price. And when farmers can no longer endure, they don't demand, they simply ask the government for help. And that budget, where does it come from? From your taxes. A deal that seems far away in Europe, involving a neighbor you rarely mention, is now making you spend more every time you shop. It trickles into every meal, every bill, every spending decision you never use to second guess. A thinner slice of beef, a smaller cup of coffee, a quick meal without dessert. All of these may seem normal, but they're actually the result of a chain reaction triggered by a lost contract. Those who once believed the government would protect American agriculture are beginning to ask questions. No longer who's right, who's wrong, but why didn't we act in time? When the competitor has already signed the deal, when Canada's containers have already landed in Europe, the US is still busy arguing over who's to blame. And then you look around and realize every link in the system is bearing part of the burden. The farmer loses the contract. The trucker faces higher costs. The vendor loses customers. The consumer pays more, all connected like a machine that has fallen out of rhythm, and no one knows who will step in to fix it. Today's story is not just about food prices or export deals. It's about how a nation can lose market share and gradually lose initiative. And when trust has left the fields, what follows is the withdrawal of capital, people, and hope. In the next part, we'll look across the border where Canada has not only signed a deal, but is building a whole new agricultural ecosystem. While the US is still arguing over priority rights, they have already become a key partner. Not through words, but through action. And as the orders continue flowing north, chances are what you're paying today is only the beginning. Across the border, Canada is achieving what we once dreamed of. If you're skeptical about what I'm about to say, try going to a supermarket and head to the beans, dairy, or canned meat sections. Skim through the labels and you'll see them more and more, product of Canada. And if you pay attention to the prices, you might notice something ironic. Goods imported from Canada are cheaper than those made in the US. No one is making loud declarations. No one is waving victory banners. But the reality is clear: Canada is gradually replacing the US as a reliable food supplier, not only in Europe, but also on store shelves within America itself. The reason doesn't lie in the barcode. It lies in the way Canada quietly but consistently has built a strong enough value chain to earn the trust of both consumers and international partners. Across the border, Canadian farmers don't have to scramble for customers after every harvest. They don't live with the constant fear of will my contract be cut next year. Even when the weather is unusual or markets fluctuate, they still have something that American farmers increasingly lack: assurance. That assurance doesn't come solely from the government, it comes from the partner nations themselves. Many European food importers not only purchase products from Canada, they also invest back, sponsoring machinery, packaging equipment, cold storage systems, and training and traceability standards, all to ensure that when Canadian products arrive in the EU, they don't need to be rechecked. And for the farmers, that's more than a contract. It's a pledge: we trust you. We will help you maintain quality. Meanwhile, many American farmers are left to fend for themselves. Outdated equipment, obsolete irrigation systems, rising fertilizer prices with no timely subsidies, and no partners investing back because policy risks scare them off. But it's not just farmers who benefit in Canada. Canadian consumers are enjoying something very simple: stability. No sudden price shocks mid-month. No scenario where something costs $4 today and $5.50 tomorrow due to a new tariff. Products like milk, soy, flour, lentils have maintained fairly steady prices throughout the first half of 2025. Not because costs are lower, but because the supply chain is better managed, logistics are optimized, and they aren't subject to unexpected tariff swings. Meanwhile, Americans, you're seeing your grocery bills grow longer, not because you're buying more, but because you're shouldering the cost of a supply chain that's increasingly distorted, from overpriced fertilizer to aluminum and steel tariffs that drive up packaging costs to storage expenses from unsold exports. What's notable is this: Canada didn't achieve this because it's stronger, but because it hasn't broken trust. They don't negotiate and then reverse course. They don't threaten to pull out of agreements. They don't turn agriculture into a tool for political squabbles. They simply focus on doing their part properly, and when that part is done well, the rest: contracts, investments, market share comes naturally. So what about Americans? You once hoped the government would help farmers reach global markets, that there would be a system to shield them from risks, enable access to technology, and connect them with sustainable markets. You once believed that America, with its capabilities, technology, and experience, would lead the clean, green, and efficient agricultural revolution, but now you're seeing that happen across the border. If you feel this is unfair, you're not alone, because what Canada is doing could have been America's dream: a clean agriculture industry with international commitments supported by both domestic and foreign investments, serving not only export markets but also domestic consumers. But instead of being realized here, it's being carried out just a few hundred miles to the north. Now, if you look again at that bag of Canadian beans in your hand at the supermarket, you might not think of it as imported goods anymore, but as a reminder that someone else has accomplished what you once hoped to do yourself. In the next part, we'll go deeper into the heart of America, where trust is beginning to fracture, where Americans are starting to realize they're no longer the chosen ones, but simply the ones paying more for things that once belonged to them. No one is loudly saying they regret it, but the silence is speaking for everyone. You won't hear shouting or see protests. But in rural areas that were once filled with campaign banners, once bustling with the roar of harvest machines and the laughter of harvest season, the atmosphere has changed. American farmers are not indifferent. They once had great hopes. When they cast their votes, they believed the person they chose could turn things around. Reopen the European market. Lower tariffs, control fertilizer prices, rebuild the agricultural credit system. They didn't ask for anything grand. just a future stable enough to hold on to ancestral land to keep their children in town, to give their hopes something to cling to. But then harvest season came and empty containers still lined up in long rows, contracts unsigned, orders not placed. Meanwhile, Canada, the quiet neighbor, silently signed deals and made deliveries. They once thought power was the strongest weapon. Now they look at Canada and realize there are things stronger than power: openness, reliability, and long-term strategy. They ask themselves if they could go back to that moment, would they think differently? But it's not just farmers who are feeling regret. Consumers, people who never put much hope in policy, are now feeling the weight in every bill. They've always been cautious. They know food prices can rise and fall with the seasons, with the markets. But this time is different. Prices are climbing steadily, not because of bad harvests, not because of crises, but because of imbalances from policies they were never consulted about. A carton of milk now costs more than before. A bag of packaged beans jumps in price. A familiar dinner dish gets replaced with something cheaper. People start recalculating meals not out of dietary choices, but because they're forced to. That feeling doesn't come from a sudden shock. It builds slowly, little by little, each day. With every swipe of a card, with every time they tell themselves, we need to rebalance this month. And then they realize the bill isn't just about prices. It's a record of a chain of consequences at the end of which consumers themselves are the final link. Though they never planted a single bean or signed a single executive order, they're the ones paying for miscalculations made from above. Elsewhere, those who have tried to keep their communities from falling apart, mayors, co-op, directors, school principals, are silently bracing themselves against a cold reality.
If we don't stem these policies, then really our town's going to collapse.
They don't make trade policy. They don't adjust import tariffs. But they are the ones witnessing their town's structure crumble bit by bit. When the first store closed, they encouraged each other. When the small factory cut hours, they lobbied for funding. But when the school cut snacks, the gas station stopped opening on weekends and the pharmacy shortened its hours. They began to understand something is breaking and they cannot fix it alone. Not because they lack ability, but because the money isn't coming in, the orders aren't returning, and trust is beginning to retreat. When the most crowded place in a small town is the funeral home, talking about the future feels out of place. 3 groups of people, 3 different sorrows, but all arriving at the same feeling being pushed off the tracks of America today. Farmers who once hoped for support now have no contracts for their harvests. Consumers who once hoped to stay untouched are now juggling unstable prices. Community leaders who once believed perseverance was enough are now watching everything slowly fall. They no longer seek someone to blame. They're learning how to adapt in confusion. They're not waiting for a miracle. But they never imagined things would spiral this far, this fast. The pain isn't in losing money. It's in not knowing what's really going on. Delayed promises. Decisions detached from real life. And so Americans across all walks of life are beginning to feel the future is no longer in their hands. They don't choose the markets. They don't control the prices. They can't hold on to trust. And this, in a quiet way, is making many people withdraw from the conversation. The world still turns. Other countries are still forging partnerships. Canada is seizing every opportunity. Meanwhile, Americans are rethinking every meal. You may live in the suburbs, a big city, or a small town, but if you once believed America would lead the way and now you're crossing off your favorite foods from the grocery list, then this story is touching you too. Maybe you don't feel terrible yet. But look around, emptier shelves, higher prices at familiar stores, friends losing jobs, children asking why you don't go to the supermarket every week anymore. That's not an accident. That's a consequence. Join me in the final part as we look toward the near future and ask a question that's not easy to answer. If things continue as they are, will Americans still have enough to eat? And if the answer is not certain, what will we do before the cost becomes unbearable? The future could get worse if we just stand by and wait. That scenario isn't far off as the agreement between Canada and the EU continues to expand while America quietly regrets its political choices of the past. In early 2026, you walk into your usual supermarket shopping list in hand, but at the checkout counter, your eyes pause. Each month, the bill increases slightly. Each week, a few more dollars. But added together, it forms a big question: how can you afford enough food and still have money for medicine tuition or a small savings for the future forecasts? From the USDA show that food prices could rise by 5 to 7% in the first quarter of 2026. especially for familiar items like rice milk and canned meat. That means millions of American families are forced to rethink every expense from their children's tuition to daily essentials. What once seemed distant has now become reality in every meal. Meanwhile, across fields in Iowa and Nebraska, many farmers are struggling through the harvest season amid canceled orders. Export markets are gone and new investments are drying up. What they fear most now is not the risk of a bad crop, but the uncertainty of when the bank will come knocking to reclaim the land passed down from their ancestors. In such a situation, the fear is no longer about failed harvests, but about lost ownership. As land is gradually absorbed by large corporations with capital and their own distribution networks, the game begins to change. It's no longer just about farm products, but about the entire supply chain, from cold storage transportation to store shelves being controlled by a few powerful groups. At that point, consumers are no longer customers with choices. They become targets to be priced. Prices no longer reflect cost, but reflect power. And food, the bare minimum to survive, becomes a luxury item decided by someone else. You may still walk into the supermarket every week. The shelves are still lit, the products still attractively displayed. But what you see packaging brands advertising slogans no longer guarantee quality or transparency. Every item you buy, every dollar you spend continues to feed a system that's quietly pushing real farmers out of the game. But the story isn't one way. In some places, people are no longer waiting. They're starting to find new paths forward. Many young farmers are returning to small-scale farming. They sell meat, eggs, vegetables directly to nearby communities. No supermarkets, no forced pricing, just a roadside stand or a weekend market, and they've built a small but real ecosystem. Consumers are changing too. Many are returning to local farmers markets, community-supported agriculture CSA programs, or ordering directly from nearby farms. They understand they may not be able to change inflation, but they can choose where to place their trust and money. In small towns, more and more mayors and local leaders are quietly doing practical work. They're not waiting for federal policies. Instead, they're building food supply chains right within the community, shared cold storage, supported transport, local markets in parks or community halls. They're learning from successful models elsewhere, from countries that were once America's trade partners. We don't need to look far. In Australia, many farms use a pre-season subscription model. Consumers pay at the start of the season, then come pick vegetables throughout the growing period. In the UK, a farm that once only served a few village households has become the main meat supplier for the region. They started small, but stayed committed. The world is changing every day. Canada is now a leader in clean, affordable, and stable agriculture. The EU has pivoted to support its farmers. And countries like Australia and the UK are finding ways to help their farmers stand on their own without depending on giant corporations. So what about us? Now is the time for each of us to ask, if no one's coming to save us, what can we do for ourselves? The answer might start very simply with the choice you make today, what you buy from whom, and why. There's no need to wait for another term, another bill, or another support package. If you've ever regretted a vote, you can start with a new decision, small but meaningful. You don't need to do something big to make a difference. You just need to use the money you spend each day to support real people making real food. The meal is yours, but the right to choose that meal, don't let it slip away again. And there's one thing worth remembering: history has never been fixed. The nations once seen as backup options can become the center if they choose the right moment to act. America once did that. And we consumers, farmers, mayors, small restaurant owners can absolutely shift the game again. Maybe from today's small decisions a new market will emerge, a new kind of agreement not signed by diplomats, but built by real people exchanging real products hand to hand. And when the flow starts to reverse, perhaps even Canada with its well-crafted strategy will look back and learn from those it once outpaced. No one knows for sure whether Canada truly wants to be America's replacement at the global agricultural table. But one thing is clear: they've stepped up at the right time in the right way, while we Americans are still tangled in debates, procedures, and unfulfilled promises. There may come a time when we look back and ask, did America miss a chance, or are we just pausing to rethink our path? We don't need more slogans. We need to listen to each other, observe how the world is shifting, and from there, learn how to adjust ourselves step by step. Not to catch up, but so we don't leave behind those who need stability the most: the farmers, the consumers, and the small communities struggling with every monthly bill. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode, where we continue telling the stories mainstream media often overlook. The analysis in this video is based on current data and an independent perspective, not intended to make absolute predictions about the future or to cause confusion. We hope this information will help the community reflect and take timely action.